Hello, everyone. I'm Dalton Ritter, and today I'll be discussing a study on the efficacy of flipped classrooms. The study itself was by Sarah Delozier et al. It's called Flipped Classrooms, a review of key ideas and recommendations for practice. It was a meta-analysis of 28 independent learning institutions creating their own studies on different degrees and different methodologies of flipped classrooms, and then putting together a bit of some conclusions. Of course, as you'll see, there are a couple of limitations to it, but we'll talk about the methodology first. Essentially, it took the findings of independent studies that came from a bunch of different disciplines and a lot of different grade levels, ranging all the way from high school to graduate level education, some of which were in medical, some of which were in physical science. They compiled and compared scores from studies containing a little bit of overlap in methodology, such as if two different studies used pair and share, or if two different studies used the same kind of flipping. And then what they did was they interpolated conclusions based on the nature and magnitude of the overlap. So obviously, if something was very significantly linked to one section of overlap, they drew a little bit more of a solid conclusion than something that was only tangentially connected. Like I said, there were limitations. It was a relatively small sample size on all 28 studies. Only 11 out of 28 studies that were conducted actually reported numerical and quantitative information on student performance. Studies were conducted over a relatively short period of time, and the sample size was pretty small on all of them. They all differed between disciplines and academic grades. This was not a standardized set of studies or a longitudinal study that might glean a little bit more information. However, this was more of a synthesis of a lot of different studies that may try to offer some sort of cohesive conclusion. And of course, the methodology between studies differed pretty pretty wildly, depending on how the lectures were actually delivered, and what they were doing in class to make up for having flipped classrooms. So the article actually found that the first portion, I shouldn't say that. The first portion that they discussed talked about the modality through which the lectures were delivered. So some lectures were delivered via videos, some were narrated PowerPoints like I'm doing right now, and some were just virtual lectures like what you would see on Zoom, or like a keynote speech that you would watch online. Now, their findings on the lecture delivery methods indicate that the actual method in which they received the learning didn't have all that much impact on whether or not the student learned it or not. And they hypothesize that, or I shouldn't say that they hypothesize about this, but they do kind of think about it has more to do about what the student learns on their own. And as you'll see later, that is a little bit more linked to what they create concerning the content. The next part talked about different modes of in-class activities. They used quizzes, clicker tests, paired, shared activities. The quizzes and clicker tests found pretty mild improvement because the students were thinking about it and using recall. So they were using kind of one of the lower levels on Bloom's taxonomy pretty regularly. So they were working with the content instead of just hearing it and internalizing it. And of course, there were a couple of studies that did use pair and share activities where they engaged with their peers to construct meaningful answers. And they found more significant gains in performance, but it's still not a huge improvement. In fact, it was still pretty mild, but it was notably better than just quizzes or clicker tests. Although it should be noted that the studies that used pair-and-share activities didn't use the same pair-and-share activity, and of course this differs between disciplines and between grade modes. Another set of studies assess the efficacy of student presentations. And what they mean by presentation is like something you would do here, where you would create something and then present it to the class. Now, these studies found that when the students taught and presented the information, it provided a little bit better recall than any of the other in-class activities, because they think that the anticipation that you have to teach something implies that you have to internalize it well enough to know it, basically. Essentially, not only is there evidence to suggest that you learn something by teaching it pretty well, but just the knowledge that they will have to teach it spurred their brains to keep going. And just as well, it could be that it's because they're interacting on a higher level with Bloom's taxonomy with the content. So instead of just recalling, they're actually synthesizing and creating content around it. So since you're using all of those actionable verbs, it's thought to believe, or it's believed to have a greater impact on whether or not the students remembered the content later on. Now, this is more about what we can take from this. A lot of it is kind of touchy because, like I said, work on flipped classes is still kind of in its infancy, and this meta-analysis doesn't really cover a whole lot. It's got a pretty small sample size. I mean, I would like to see a meta-analysis that covers a larger, more standardized body of work. I think that would be more useful to actually create a qualifiable success on flipped classrooms. However, I think that this does show some promising advances in how we look at data and how we look at cognition, but it's all again not really anything crazy new. A lot of people have always thought about this, but requiring students to engage with their content on their own terms and think about it on their own terms, creating things and synthesizing information so that they can pass it on to others is always, I shouldn't say always, but it has been an effective method of getting students to remember and engage a little bit better for a long time. But this is just evidence to support that thought. And while it's not perfect evidence, it is pretty significant. Like I said, this is my source. It's just Flipped Classrooms, a review of key ideas and recommendations for practice by Sarah Delozier et al. Thank you.